Hello, my name is Justin, or Teacup on Discord, and today I'm bringing you a deck profile over my second place Chaos Mimic list from the GenCon RLE. This deck is tons of fun. I think it's one of the most fun decks I've played in a while for the MHA CCG. Just because we get to do a lot of cool things and play a lot of cool cards that other decks don't get to. We also get to play a lot of cool cards that other decks do get to and make them feel even better, especially with attacks on virtue of just picking them up and playing them over and over again. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So starting off with the attack lineup, our best attack in the entire deck and our main offensive tool is going to be 3 copies of Twisting Azure Inferno. We honestly don't even need the 4th in most matchups, which is why there's only 3 here, because we just get to pick them up. Usually the reason to have 4 is so that you can usually have 2 in a turn and have that be somewhat consistent. But we get to just check 2 of them and then pick up 2 of them. This is also only a 57 card list, so we generally do get 2 into our discard pretty quickly. And even then, sometimes just 1 of these is plenty to kill a lot of characters. Our next attack is going to be 3 copies of Double Jab Pummel. This combos off of every card except for 1 in our attack lineup, and it's just phenomenal. It's one of the best flow cards in the entire game. It says that when we do pick up 1 or 2 twistings and we have a double jab in hand, that it doesn't matter that 3 of our other cards in our hand are foundations, because with training weights, we're going to put a ton of damage on this. We're going to make them have to block it, and then we're going to draw more cards. And when we do have attacks in hand, then we're going to make them block it, draw more cards, get more preferential attacks in hand, maybe get our 3rd twisting if we're looking for that. And if not, we just get +2 to our check. It's a phenomenal attack. It did everything that I wanted it to over the entire weekend. Our last really offensive attack is going to be 3 copies of Trigger Transformation. This card just gets a ton of damage. And it's always going to be a 4-diff on our character, just because we're building so many assets. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's generally a little bit better in the later game, because sometimes, if you have just kind of a bad hand first turn, you might not have 3 assets yet, so it's a little bit more expensive. It's not going to have as much damage, and you're not going to have momentum to be able to build in that extra trigger, which is one of the better things about the card. Although getting momentum in this meta is a little bit difficult, so it ends up being a bit of a negative that it does require momentum to do that. But either way, it's absolutely phenomenal. It's 5 base speed, and it just gets a ton of damage. This card's never going to be less than 10 damage with our character, and it's just gonna be an absolute bomb, especially later in the game. Moving on, after our really offensive focused attacks, we have quite a few utility attacks that are great to throw as pokes in the beginning of the game. And the first one of those is going to be 3 copies of Shocking Entrance. This card is just a little bit better in terms of utility than Trigger Transformation, because it says just for discarding a card, we can replace that card with any asset in our discard, which is absolutely crucial when our game plan relies on having training weights and trigger in our stage. So being able to play this early and go pick up a training weights that we checked is absolutely phenomenal. Going to pick up a trigger that we checked, absolutely great. You can never really go wrong playing this. And while we don't get the 2 speed if it's on the second card in card pull or later, it's still worth it a ton of times. So absolutely phenomenal. Honestly, I could see a different version of this deck going up to 4 of these and 4 twisting as well. Next on the utility attacks, we have 3 copies of Electric Jolt. This card is just fantastic. It's a great early poke. It's great late game when it's later in the string and we've committed all of our training weights 3-4 times, so they're all given 7 damage each, and we just discard some momentum because some attacks hit for EX2. So it's great late game. It's great early game. There's really nothing that needs to be said about this card at this point. I think everything's been said about it. Next up, we have 2 copies of Zero Gravity Lift. Another card that almost everything that needs to be said has been said about this card already. One of the things that is important about it in our deck is that it does have the throw keyword, which is great because we throw a lot of damage on attacks. So in some matchups, we can just throw this card down, and it can be really threatening, especially in the matchups where they block a lot. So your Eraserhead matchups, your Amajiki, where a 15 damage throw is actually pretty significant portion of their life, even if they block it, and they've been blocking all our other attacks. So it's really our only way to get damage in. It's also great to play this card early, get into momentum, and then play a twisting and remove it to slam twisting into our momentum, and just have +1 to all of our checks without even having a card in card pool. That usually just means that you're going to win that turn, especially if you have any more twistings in your hand. Next up, we have, or finally actually for the attacks, we have 2 copies of Cheerful Uppercut. This card is just really a great block, especially when we get to always pick it up with Mimic whenever we need that defensive option in our hand. I think this card is a little bit harder to run in a lot of decks because you can't really justify running it at more than like a 2 or 3 of. Unlike Ice Storm, it is a 5 diff, which makes it, while it's kind of good on offense, it makes it a lot harder to use on offense, whereas Ice Storm really just does double duty as both an extremely offensive card and an extremely defensive card. So this card usually gets ran at much lower copies, but in us, that's fine. We're just going to go pick it up. So it absolutely feels great in Mimic just because of the fact that we get to pick it up like any of our other attacks, especially on defense, so we can just slam down 1 or 2 of them as blocks, which is phenomenal. Moving on to the foundations, we don't have many of them because the split is 19-19-19, being perfectly balanced. But we will start off with our 0 diffs, starting off with Release at 2 of. Release is just a great card. I don't think anyone doesn't know that already. But especially in our character, when a lot of times, especially the later we get into the game, we just don't need foundations anymore because we have like 3 or 4 triggers or something like that. It just becomes great to be able to destroy what little foundations we have. Really to look at your opponent, see them say stun 2 when you have like 5 foundations and be like, oh, I'm almost half committed out, but then just destroy them to release because like it doesn't even really matter for you. It just feels great. So this card's great. It definitely helps us survive a little bit longer in the late game once we don't need our foundations anymore. And then in the early game, it's still perfectly fine. It's also a 2 high, which is extremely relevant in our meta currently. Next up on the foundations list is 4 basic trainings. This card helps turn on Twisting Azure Inferno. We can check poorly on a Twisting Azure Inferno, commit an asset, get 2 damage, and then respond basic training, get 1 more. And now we have a Twisting Azure Inferno that can't have its damage reduced to not let us get the enhance off, because our first enhance is going to be to hack our checks. So it's absolutely great. It's also one of the few deadlock cards we have in the entire deck, and that deadlock is extremely relevant. So it really says if you've built multiple of these, your opponent just can't go into deadlock against you because they will not be able to block all your attacks, especially because 2 or 3 of them are Twisting Azure Infernos. Our next foundation is going to be 3 copies of Training with Gunhead. This was a bit of a late addition to the deck. I was running up against a throw deck and realized that just like 7-handers, we can die a little bit easily to throws, or a little bit more easily than I'd like, and realized it had throw hate, and then realized that it had the top enhance that I think a lot of people glance over, but if you're playing a Twisting Azure deck on Chaos, it's an extremely relevant enhance and should be a strong consideration for your deck, because +1 speed when you're already giving minus to their checks is just absolutely brutal to a lot of decks. So it definitely felt great over the weekend, and honestly, if you could find a slot for a 4th, I think it'd be worth it. Next up, we have 4 copies of Chivalrous Competitor. This card's just great. It gives you it doesn't even give you card advantage over your opponent, but as many others have pointed out before with this card, you don't really need to care about the fact that your opponent gets a card on their turn, because they're just going to draw that next turn anyways, right? So if you get an extra attack and they get an extra block, it doesn't really matter, because that extra attack, especially in our deck where we're, again, trying to make our attacks unblockable to begin with, and slamming a bunch of damage on all of them with training weights, we just generally don't care if they have an extra block, because that's not going to be that's not going to be what's between us winning and not. So absolutely great card. And then it also, what little foundations we do have, says that our opponent's not going to destroy them. It's our decision whether they get destroyed or not, which is also fantastic. Next up is, and I should mention, once we get later to Mimicry, that this card also feels great to Mimic, because, especially in the early game, if you happen to be in a position where you do need foundations, you can just Mimic this card, you can get an extra card, and then you actually go up 1 foundation, which also feels pretty darn good. Next up, we have 2 copies of Struggling with Studies. This card is just great defensively. We get to pick up our Cheerfuls again. We get to pick up attacks that we really didn't want to block with. We had a Twisting in hand. We didn't want to block with it, but we had to, or we die, and we get to pick it back up. So we have it to into our attack turn. This card's just fantastic for defense. And honestly, there was supposed to be 3 in the deck, but I didn't get a chance to test that version because I forgot to make the change on the physical deck. So I ended up just running 2, and I think that was plenty, honestly. I don't think you really have to go up to 3 on that. Next up, we have 2 Nice Tries. I think this card is absolutely fantastic. I think all 3 of its symbols you should strongly consider playing at least some number, if not just straight up 4 of these. Especially if you're playing an aggressive game plan, because while some defensive decks might like the -3 speed that Specialist gives on air or good, your offensive decks are just going to want to commit this on their turn and be okay with the fact that it's only -2 speed. This card's absolutely fantastic, and I think there's plenty of other cards that could fit in this slot on this deck, but I was perfectly happy with the choice that I ended up going with on Nice Try. Next up, we have Frozen, which feels a bit counterintuitive, just like Release, because we are destroying foundations, and we don't typically build a lot of foundations. But what I've found is, especially, like I said, when we get more set up, when we have all the triggers and all the training weights that we need to really go in, and we don't have to use our foundations anymore, we just get to destroy them. A lot of times we get to play an attack, commit training weights, commit a foundation to ready training weights, and then destroy it to Frozen. And we've gotten a bunch of damage, and if it's a Twisting Azure Inferno, we've said -1 to all your block checks, and we've also committed them down 1. And it really helps in the later game when you're going up against a deck that did build to 10 or built to Deadlock, to really eat through their foundations, so that when you throw the final few moves that really do the damage, they do so, right? Last up on the foundations is just 1 copy of Vast Hybrid. This card's mainly just here just to slam momentum when we need it. Being able to slam momentum, say +1 to our next check, and then discard it for whatever we need it for, whether it be training weights or trigger transformation, feels really good. But we don't really want to run it anymore because we can't copy it with Mimicry, because it says unique, and also it says unique, so we can only build 1 to begin with. And we do have some unique assets that we're running multiples of, so we don't really want to double up more on the foundations at all. Moving on to the absolute best part of the list, which is the assets in the list. We're going to start off with 4 triggers. These are absolutely amazing. This card is just insane and makes this character as fun as he is. Being able to say that this asset counts for essentially 3 foundations to pass checks is phenomenal. It counts for 1 on your turn, 1 on your opponent's turn, and then 1 just committing it between 1 of the 2 turns, and it just feels great. The top response is also not even blank, right? Like, it's actually extremely relevant on our kill turns to be able to just draw more cards. Sometimes I've used it to draw into that last attack that I needed when I had plenty of stuff to be able to check it. I just need the attack actually in my hand. Sometimes I've used it to just ready up foundation so I can keep committing training weights, because one of the only problems with training weights is sometimes having resources to commit to it. And this says that when we only have 3 foundations, we actually, let's say we have 2 of these, we actually have 5 foundations. So this card feels absolutely fantastic. And really, you could not ask for anything more out of a Mimic-based asset. Moving on to the next best asset in the entire deck, and it's going to be 4 copies of Training Weights. This card is fantastic. It slams so much damage. I think the worst part of this card in other decks is the fact that it only puts 1 damage on at first, but we just ignore that. We say 3 damage out of the gate, and it's fantastic. Making all of your moves 10 damage is just a really solid game plan, and there's really nothing else I can say about this card as far as Mimic goes. Next up, we have 3 copies of Takoyaki. Honestly, I kind of like this card at a 4 of instead of a 3 of, because drawing a card off destroying it is just great late game. I also like the fact that we can just build it because it gives us card advantage and damage reduction. So it doesn't feel bad to hold it, to instead of holding for a block, build it and just say, oh, we'll just get a card on their turn if we need it. And then when they don't attack for whatever reason, then we have an extra asset going into our turn. So this just really feels like everything you want out of an asset in a Mimic deck, other than trigger and training weights, obviously, because it also just says 6 check. So absolutely fantastic card, and I definitely would consider going to 4 of. Next up is Fancy Feast. This is in the deck mainly for its enhanced cost, not its enhanced effect. We have 0 cards that care about the effect itself, but it does say that we get to commit an asset for 2 damage whenever we need it, or for -1 damage whenever we need it. We see that they're playing Twisting 2, and they get it to 7 damage, and we say no, it's 6. Extremely relevant. Or we're running Twisting, and we haven't been able to build training weights. We can just, accidentally get off 2 Twisting Azure Inferno enhances off of 3 Takoyakis and 1 Fancy Feast, which did happen over the weekend and felt pretty good to do. The Deadlock Enhance is also, other than basic training, our only other Deadlock, which is also very relevant, especially if we do get locked into that later game. Next up is 2 copies of Battle Arena. And this card is great. I think it deserves a slot in a lot of non-Mimic decks, but it's usually just harder to find that slot for it. It does count as 2 foundations if you really think about it, but usually that's a bit harder to justify, especially because it gives not only you momentum but your opponent momentum as well. But either way, it does absolutely everything you want it to in Mimic. And another really cool aspect to it is the fact that since it's a response for a +2 or 2 check, we can, with the basic training, if we're trying to get the enhance off because they have damage reduction on the first enhance, we can just commit this response to do nothing. Just give +2 to our check to play an attack, even if we check to 5 anyways. But so that we can respond for 2 damage and get our Twisting Azure to 7 damage anyways. Next up, we have 2 Mimicries. This is probably the most lackluster card in the deck, mainly because of our foundations, though, not because of it itself. I just don't think the foundation lineup we have feels that great with Mimicry. I think there's some other cooler things you can do, and I think there's a version of the deck that absolutely does those cool things. I think there's a version of the deck that runs Cool Student and then has Mimicry copy it and put it on top of your deck so you can guarantee checking an asset. That definitely feels good. I just didn't get a chance to test it out, and I didn't know if it was consistent enough to warrant running that card. Our last card in the main board is just going to be 1 copy of League of Villains. This would be more copies if we just built more foundations, but we don't, so it just kind of feels bad sometimes. And it's a 4 diff, so that also kind of feels bad. It's a really fantastic card. It's just kind of hard to run when we build as few foundations as we do, which is one of the downsides. But unfortunately, we did want the amount of assets we have because we do want to check them pretty often. Last up, we just have the sideboard, which didn't end up coming in as much, or didn't end up coming in handy as much, but still had quite a few tech pieces just for some of the more rough matchups. Some of the most important tech pieces we have were just the 3 copies of attacks in our sideboard, which were Twisting Azure Inferno, Cheerful Uppercut, and Zero Gravity Lift. These usually came in just to shore up our game plan on our attacks and be more consistent on whether we're being the more aggressive or more defensive deck, especially since sometimes we can take a more defensive role and sometimes we can take a more aggressive role. We're a bit more mid-rangey than a lot of the other decks out there. So in something like the Overhaul finals that I was in, these 2 attacks that aren't cheerful came in for the cheerfuls because cheerfuls just didn't really matter to Andrew's game plan, and having the extra attacks to be a bit more aggressive could matter. And of course, didn't end up mattering, but that's what happens. And then cheerful can come in when we need to be a bit more defensive. Next up, we have just 1 copy of Self-Assured. This is really just here for the Muriel matchup. Nothing else, really. Didn't come in very many times throughout the weekend. Next up, we have 2 Irrefutables and 2 Broken Psyches. Both of these are just 3 low blocks that are also 2 diffs that can just replace nice tries if they're a bit more useful. Sometimes Broken Psyche is a bit more useful, especially if you're going into a matchup that doesn't have anything to get rid of your momentum. So if you can get an early momentum, you can just say 2 damage, which is sometimes a lot more relevant than -2 speed, depending on the matchup. And then irrefutables just are great for if you run into those symbols. Being able to say your snack time does nothing is fantastic when you're playing a deck that wants their snack time not to do nothing. You know, being able to say something like self-assured, or not self-assured, struggling with studies doesn't exist when they need to be able to pick one up is just fantastic. So it's really just a tech piece for when we need it. Lastly, we also have 1 copy of Struggling with Studies. I don't think this came in at any point. It was just the 3rd one that I was planning to put in the main, just because we needed it. That we didn't usually brought it in. I think there's 1 or 2 matchups where I did bring it in, but it ended up just sitting on our sideboard for the most part. And lastly, we just have 1 Fancy Feast, just to have the extra deadlock threat. This does come in. This came in once when I needed more assets, or I felt like I needed more assets in the game plan. And it also came in when I needed the deadlock threat. But with that said, that is our Mimic deck. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.